Hi, I'm Barbara Wyndham, a member of Betham's Jewish and Israel Advocacy Committee, also known as Betham JIAC. Welcome to the second class in our three-part crash course on the history of Israel. First, a few housekeeping items. After today, there are three more classes, which will be held every Sunday morning through February 12th. Like all the sessions, today's class will last an hour and a half, including Q&A. Within a few days after the class, you'll receive a recording of this session in case you'd like to review it. Charlotte encourages you to take notes. It'll help you process and internalize some of the material that's covered. That said, any slides that she uses in her lecture will be shared with you at the end of the 5-class series. We received rave reviews from many after the first class. Thank you for being in touch with us. The comments were mostly about the content. People raved about the depth of Charlotte's knowledge, the clarity of her explanations, and the thoroughness of the Q&A. We also heard from some of you that Charlotte was speaking too quickly. We appreciate all of your feedback. Please know that we have asked Charlotte to slow down when she returns live, which will be on next week. Just a reminder that while the next 3 classes will be live on Zoom, today's class was pre-recorded, so yes, Charlotte will still be speaking quickly. She will address to your requests starting on January 29th. Today's pre-recorded lecture with Charlotte Korchak will be followed by a live Q&A at the end, and the Q&A will be handled by Dr. Mike Harris. It will be handled in a moderator format. You've met Charlotte during the last class, but let me briefly introduce you to Mike. Dr. Mike Harris was one of the founders of the San Francisco Voice for Israel and now serves as a lay leader for Stand With Us in the Bay Area. He has spoken about Israel at synagogues, churches, political groups, and senior citizen centers, as well as standing up for Israel against anti-Israel demonstrators on the streets of the Bay Area. He's appeared on the radio and television news as a spokesman for Stand With Us and also for San Francisco Voice for Israel. In his spare time, he was a pediatrician in Marin County, but is now happily retired, living in Sonoma County. His book, Winning a Debate with an Israel Hater, was first published in October 2015, with a second edition in November 2018. I've read it, I highly recommend it. During today's lecture, if there's something you don't understand or would like explained more fully, just type your questions into chat whenever you think of them. Mike will answer your questions after the video lecture ends. Please go to chat now and set it so that your questions go to Jeff Carmel. You'll look, by the way, Jeff is another Betham JIAC member. Jeff will collect and compile the questions for Mike to answer. To be able to send your questions, click on the chat icon, click on the down arrow in the blue bar, scroll down and highlight the name Jeff Carmel, or you can highlight what says, please send questions to me, Jeff Carmel. That's the only way Mike will get your questions when the video ends. So I'll repeat that process once more. Click on the chat icon, click on the down arrow on the blue bar, scroll down and highlight, please send questions to me, Jeff Carmel. We definitely encourage you to ask questions throughout the lecture and during the Q&A. Now I'd like to thank our co-sponsors of the program, Betham JIAC and Contra Costa JCC. This course is happening thanks to their time, effort, planning, and financial generosity. I'd also like to thank the following partners for their financial support: Congregation Kolomet Palo Alto, Congregation Beth David Saratoga, and the Sonoma County Israel Committee. And thanks to all of you for making time for this crash course. As of this week, there are over 400 people participating. It's amazing. Again, just as a reminder, Charlotte's lecture today is pre-recorded. Near the end of the video, Charlotte refers to the last session as session 4. That's not actually the case for us. Our last class will be session 5, giving Charlotte a chance to slow down in her next 3 classes, deepening the explanation of the issues from 1948 to today. Having 5 classes will also allow more time for learning answers to difficult questions about Israel. Because today's lecture is a video that is being shared with you, you will not be able to adjust the screen size or make the video full screen. You can, however, turn on closed captioning if you want to. If you do, though, I hope you're a speed reader because Charlotte does speak very quickly. One last reminder, all questions should be typed into chat. There's no need to raise your hand. If possible, I'll try to make your questions, if possible, please do try to make your questions concise, relevant to what's being taught, and ask in the form of a question, not a speech. Also remember to direct your questions to Jeff Carmel and to please use respectful language. I will be working with Mike to get as many questions as possible answered when the video of Charlotte ends. Those questions that are not handled today will be answered at a future class. Now, here's Charlotte Korchak.
So last week, we were kind of setting the stage. We ended by setting the stage for this session. Now, this session is going to focus on nationalism. It's going to focus on the emergence of Jewish nationalism alongside Arab nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th century. And really, we're going to get all the way up to the founding of the State of Israel, really 1947, getting us into the War of Independence, the beginning stages of the War of Independence. So if we go back to the end of last class, we have a reality where we were talking about getting into the kind of the late 18th, early 19th century. And we spoke about how the territory that is today Israel was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Now, let's jump back to Europe for a second. So the Ottoman Empire is in control here. And in Europe, we have what we know as this rising ideology that is nationalism, this idea of a national state, as opposed to imperialism, which was kind of the norm of the world for centuries. Comes this idea of maybe smaller national states. And then you have the emergence of ideas like citizenship and civil rights. And what we see happening as a result of this is Jews in certain places in Europe are being emancipated, given citizenship, given the right to vote, given the right to in even some places run for political office. And really what we see is a lot of the restrictions that were placed on Jews start to be alleviated in some areas at some time during this time period. And as a result of that, interestingly enough, we actually see that Jews are able to really start to progress in society and make their way into professions that they were never really able to be in, like being a lawyer or being a doctor or doing something outside of money lending, let's be honest, right? And what we see, and being professors, especially getting into much more advanced education as quotas in universities are lifted or are expanded to include more Jews. And so we see as with the rise of this notion of civil rights, individual rights, national states, citizenship, we also see the rise of Jewish progress, and Jews really start to advance in society. Now, yes, that doesn't mean that they were free of anti-Semitism. Many of the Jews who were able to advance were let go of much of their anti-Semitism, because essentially the error was, if you kind of just let go of the thing that we say that we hate about the Jews at this time, then you'll be accepted in our society. We saw this a lot in Germany with a lot of Jews converting to be Christians or just joining the Reform movement, where they really let go of a lot of the old school traditional elements of what will become known as Orthodox Judaism. And with all of this comes, of course, the rise of anti-Semitism, right? We see this trend, we talked about it last time, I think, but this trend of, Jews experience a lot of anti-Semitism. Then there's this period of progress. Sorry, I just want to check. Is everyone with me or am I frozen? I just want to make sure, because I'm seeing some of you move, some of you not move. I'm okay. Okay. So we see this as a trend in Jewish history where, Jews will suffer like a huge wave of anti-Semitism. And then there'll be this kind of lull period where it's kind of not as acceptable. And so Jews are given, again, this ability to kind of progress, and the restrictions are alleviated. And then they really do start to progress in society. And they get to this place where now people can point at Jews and say, oh, but look at them. They're privileged. Look at their wealth. Look at what they're doing in our society. They're taking over our society. Fill in the blank, but it's usually the same kind of rhetoric. And we hear the same thing today, right? It's the same trend, right? Of Jews over the last 75 years being able to really grow out of the Holocaust. And now, of course, Jews are being accused of being these white privileged Jews. And therefore, it's not a big deal that we do X, Y, and Z to the Jews. It's the same idea. And this is what's happening in the 19th century. And so what emerges in Europe is what becomes known as the famous Jewish question, right? What are we going to do with our Jews? And at some point, you really have Jews start to kind of answer this question, where what we start to see is Jewish thinkers in Europe really try to analyze what is the next step for the Jewish people. Look at all the anti-Semitism we've experienced in Europe. Maybe there's another option. And with the rise of this idea of a national state comes this idea of, oh, that's it, right? Let's put these two things together. The Jews should go back to their historic homeland. And eventually what we'll see is the development of what becomes known as political Zionism. And so they should return home and reestablish their sovereignty in that home. And so in the middle of the 19th century is really when we start to see this kind of, hear this kind of rhetoric of let's return home. You have people like Moshe Hess in the middle of the 19th century, who's a labor Zionist thinker, who's really talks about returning home and buying land and working that land. You'll have others emerge towards the end of the 19th century. But let's see how this all kind of comes to a head. So of course you have this rise of, again, not so much, but some Zionist thought. Remember Zionism tying back to this ancient notion of Jews yearning to return and wanting to be in our historic homeland. And then the anti-Semitism reaches a head in Russia, a place where Jews had suffered pogrom after pogrom. I mean, we invented the word pogrom, right, to describe the massacres that we'd experienced in Europe. And of course, in the middle of the 19th century, we had a leader in Russia who was actually really good to the Jews, and that was Tsar Alexander II. But then, of course, the Tsar gets assassinated in 1881. It's blamed on the Jews, and there's another pogrom against the Jews, a really harsh pogrom, and a pogrom where specifically Russian police were actually instructed to not protect the Jews, to either sit back and watch, and in some circumstances they participated. And this is kind of going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back for some Russian Jews. Now, we know that for a lot of Russian Jews, this will be the thing that will cause them to leave the Russian territories. But many of them will immigrate to other parts of Europe or to the United States if they can get into the US. But some will have kind of gotten this Zionist bug, and they decide to make that journey. And so we see also happen post-pogrom is the rise of what I would really see is the first Zionist organization in modern times, which was the organization that's called Chovavei Zion, the Lovers of Zion, created by a guy named Leon Pinsker, another labor Zionist in the middle of the 1880s post-pogrom. And this is going to really encourage Jews from the Russian territories to immigrate to what is now Palestine, right? Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1882, we have the beginning of the first Aliyah. Now, the first Aliyah, the first immigration is what we call it, which is the first really re-immigration of Jews to this land, will go on from 1882 until 1903. Now, there are different characteristics to this Aliyah. Again, this Aliyah was mostly rooted in labor Zionist ideas, meaning let's buy land, something we couldn't really do in Europe, and let's work the land and let's create a new Jew. But in this case, the new Jew is not going to be the Jabotinsky new Jew. We'll talk about him in a second. But the new Jew, meaning again, the agriculturalist, the farmer, the guy who's gonna work the land, till the fields. That's the idea. And so you have Jews coming in, what we would really call the pioneers, who come in and buy land and start to work that land. Now we have to jump back to the Ottoman territory known as Palestine. Now, under the Ottoman Empire, let me just pull up a map real quick. Under the Ottoman Empire, we know that this territory existed. Sorry, why is this doing this? Come on, be my friend. Oh, it's back there. There we go. You guys see the map? So first of all, let's notice a few things. One is the Ottoman territory is divided up into different provinces. But notice that the province or the territory that Palestinians today would refer to as historic Palestine, which is what you see in the light gray, just not including the Golan Heights. This territory, as you can see under the Ottomans, was actually divided up into 3 different territories, right? So you see that the northern part of the territory was part of the Vilayet of Beirut, or the province of Beirut. The southern tip down here of the Negev was part of the larger vilayet of Syria. And then the center territory on the map is actually going to be part of the district of Jerusalem. And so first of all, what we understand is the territory that we call Palestine, right? We have to understand it as a territory without defined borders throughout history. Why? Because it was under empires, right? It was being controlled by consecutive empires where there weren't any borders. It was just part of a larger empire. And even in this case, when the Ottomans divided their empire up into different provinces, we see that Palestine didn't remain one distinct territory with a distinct people with a distinct character. It was just another territory that, again, they chose to divide up into 3 different territories. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is in decline. It is suffering economically, and it unfortunately has to raise taxes on its subjects. And so what happens around the middle of the 19th century, there are what you would call there were different classes of Arabs who lived in this territory at the time. Now, let's just get the numbers out there so we understand what I'm talking about. First of all, in the land itself, there are about 400,000 people in the middle of this 19th century. Of those people, 30,000 of them are Jewish. 370,000 of them are other people, the majority of that 370,000 being Arabs. Okay, now again, when we say Arabs at this time, let's understand we are talking about tribes, clans. Okay, let's note that Arab nationalism, which we'll talk about in just a second, had yet to fully take form. And so the people in the Middle East at the time were tribal, living under empires. So they were tribal. They wouldn't identify necessarily as Arabs. They would identify as usually with their, sorry, Adele, one second. They'd identify with their religion and with their tribe. So I'm a Husseini Muslim, or I'm a Halabi Druze. Go ahead, Adele.
Yeah, could you zip through that really quickly. Could you please go over the numbers again? Because that's really important.
Yes, no problem. So 400,000 total, 30,000 Jews, 370,000 other, and of those other, the majority are Arabs, okay? Meanwhile, the rest of that 400,000, okay, that's not Arabs and not Jews, are going to be just other ethnic groups: Greeks, Turks, Persians, Circassians, Assyrians, just different ethnic groups that are not Arabs. And so so the Jews just make up one of those other minority groups that live here alongside the majority, which are Arabs, these Arab tribes. Now, within the Arabs, within these people, there are different classes. The first class are what we call the Effendis. I'm gonna write it into the chat so you guys can, if you're taking notes, it'll be easier. So the Effendis were the predominant clans, the wealthier clans. They were known as the families, the core families that kind of really were seen as the leaders of this territory. Again, the Ottomans being the leaders far away, leading from Istanbul, but on the ground, my local sheikh, my local, clan leader is going to be the guy that I'm most loyal to politically. So you've got the Effendis, and then you've got another class, which are called the Filahin. The Filahin were like the farmers, the peasant farmers, lower class in terms of economics. And essentially what happened when the Ottomans in the middle of the 19th century raised taxes was the Filahin found themselves in some circumstances needing to sell their land to the Effendis. Now, this is eventually going to cause some problems, right? Because they're going to sell their land at a relatively, decent, normal price. And then what's going to happen? 20 years later, come the Jews in the 1880s and the 1890s, and they're coming with money. They're being funded by Zionists in Europe and supporters from different places. So they come in, and the Effendis are going to now sell the land that they had bought from the Filahin to the Jews at much higher prices, exorbitant prices, in fact. But the Jews pay. But there are some problems. So let's start with the non-problems first. Of most of the communities they ended up in, most of the places that they ended up, there was nobody there. It was barren, really poor land to a certain extent, or land that needed a lot of work to flourish. So you have the first communities. Rishon LeZion is going to be the first. You're going to have Zichron Yaakov being the second, Petach Tikva being the third. So as if you hear the trend, if you know these places, we're talking about the coastal plain, right? Or what we know of as today as Gush Dan. And then also up in the Galilee and up in the Chula Valley. And in those areas, unfortunately, there were circumstances where Jews would show up to land that they purchased, and they would find Arabs living on that land, Filahin, who never left, who were essentially what we would use in a term today. We would say they're squatting on this land, owned by somebody else who's an absentee landowner who sold the land to the Jews. And so when the Jews show up in this specific circumstance, when the Jews would show up, they'd have two options, right? Tell these people to leave. This is our land now. We bought it. We bought it with the intention of wanting to work it ourselves. So you need to leave. Or you can stay here and you can work the land, but we're the owners of the land now, and you have to pay us a sort of rent to work this land and live on this land. And both happened. And what we have to realize is that the former, which would essentially be displacement, right, in the most mild terminology that I can use, this is going to grow into an ideology, really, a narrative. And that this is really the early hints of the modern day, very aggressive Palestinian narrative that says that the Jews showed up and stole our land. Now, as a historian, I tend to take a step back when I look at history, especially today. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of people out there who will say things like, well, there's your truth and there's my truth. There's your facts and there's my facts. Now, I have a really big issue with this as a historian. I don't like to play fast and loose with the word truth. There are truths in this world. However, with that, we have to also realize that a truth doesn't exist in a vacuum. And the way in which people perceive that truth will affect history, will affect narrative. That doesn't make it true. So for example, there was a war in 1948, and I think we'll all agree that it is a fact, it is a truth that there was a war in 1948. But for the Jews, their perception of that war was a war of independence. And for them, that is, yes, their narrative. That's how they felt. But for the Palestinians, it was a Nakba, right? It was a catastrophe. Same truth, same war, totally different perceptions and experiences. And so when you look at what happened in the late 1900s, what you have is, the late 1800s, is you have a circumstance where Jews didn't steal land. And in fact, there's really almost no evidence to support the idea that Jews came and stole land and actually took land by force. However, for the Palestinian who's being displaced by this random Jew who just showed up and said, oh, I bought this land, why should he believe him? And so for him, it feels like my land is being stolen from me. But he knows that he sold his land earlier to this other guy. But again, even if it started out as my land was taken from me, right? That morphed into, again, this more aggressive narrative as time went on and the story gets worse to they came and stole our land. But again, let's be very clear. There was no illegal theft of land, but there was some great discomfort when Jews arrived to land that they discovered Arabs were living on. Now, Jews come in, they buy the land, like we said, they settled. Yes, I'll be sending a recording. Don't worry. I'll be sending a recording. Just I'm answering the question in the chat. Yes, you can catch up. So Jews are settling, they're building, they're working the fields, they're starting to, get things to flourish, but it's very hard. And a lot of them end up going back to Europe. And a lot of Jews aren't coming because it's a hard life. It's hard to imagine I'm going to leave a city in Europe and I'm going to go try to settle a random desert. Like, no. And so what ends up happening actually is because the Jews are improving the conditions and settling land that before was barren, and now it's flourishing again. Well, they need workers and they don't have Jews to employ. So they start to employ Arabs. And what we actually see in the late 19th century is not just immigration by Jews, about 28,000 who are part of this first Aliyah, but a bunch of Arabs also who immigrated because now they're starting to see economic opportunity in this territory, right? Remember Arabs, this idea, many of them are nomadic. They would move around as tribes. And so this was an opportunity. And so we see both this increase in these two, you see an increase in both these populations as a result of the efforts by the Jews in the first Aliyah. Now, meanwhile, while all this is happening, in the Arab world, in the Middle East, the idea of nationalism is also gaining steam amongst Arabs, right? This idea that the Arabs are actually one nation is starting to become an idea. And we start to see Arabs, specifically in Lebanon and Syria, start to really develop this idea of what becomes known as Arab nationalism and eventually pan-Arabism. And so where was this coming from? Well, first of all, they were under an empire. They were being controlled and ruled by Turks who were not Arabs, okay, and spoke a different language. And the only thing that really unified them would be if you were Muslim. And that's what really unified people under the Ottomans. And so two things happened. One was the emergence of Arabism coming from Christians who lived in Lebanon, who wanted to highlight Arabism as the unifying factor within Arab nationalism. That it wouldn't be Islam because we're not Muslims and we want to be part of this, but we are Arabs and we speak Arabic. And we enjoy and loud Arab culture. And so we need to have this Arabism needs to now become an idea, and we should create an Arab nation around this notion. And then you've got other Arabs in Syria who are Muslims who are just saying, we want to get rid of the Ottoman Empire. They're not doing us any favors. Let's unite around this idea again that we are the Arabic speaking peoples. Even though we are all a bunch of different tribes, we speak the language of the Quran. And that becomes this linguistic idea becomes the other unifying factor. So culture, art, language. And so we start to see the rise of Arab nationalism, and it spreads throughout the Middle East. I mean, goes all the way down into the Hijaz, into the Arabian Peninsula, where you have the Hashemites under Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, who's going to also become an Arab nationalist. So we start to see the spread of this idea of Arab nationalism slowly in the late 19th and into the early 20th century. So that's Arab nationalism in the Middle East. Jews are coming in, settling the land, right, from Europe. And then let me just show you guys this slide, which is what I just spoke about. First, Aliyah. But now let's jump back to Europe. So this was labor Zionism, pushed by labor Zionism. That was the idea. But in the late 19th century emerges another type of Zionism, what we would today call political Zionism. We all know who ushered this along, a guy by the name of Theodor Herzl, right up here in the corner. Theodor Herzl, before you read everything on the slide, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and I'll put it back up after because I'm going to tell a story and it's not good to have the distraction when you hear a story. But Theodor Herzl was an assimilated guy in Europe. He was actually part of the upper echelons of Austrian society. He was a playwright. He was in all the popular clubs. And again, the upper echelon, the bourgeoisie, as we would call it. And so Herzl kind of didn't really experience anti-Semitism. He spoke German and he was very much an assimilated Jew. And so he was a Jew by name. And so he thought that the answer to anti-Semitism was actually assimilation. Let's just all assimilate and become German and Austrian and French. And once we do that, just like I haven't experienced anti-Semitism, there won't be anti-Semitism anymore. And then, of course, as a journalist, he gets sent to France. And he witnesses the famous Dreyfus affair, where Alfred Dreyfus, a captain in the French military, is going to be brought up on trumped up charges of treason, selling state secrets to the Germans. And he goes to cover this trial. And as Dreyfus is being brought to the courthouse, he's hearing this mob outside of death to the Jews and the Jew, the dirty Jew. And it dawns on him. It's his aha moment of, oh my God, look at this guy. He's totally assimilated. He fought in the French military. He rose up to this high-ranking position. And even he is being accused of being this nation within a nation. And it almost dawned on him, Jews will always be Jews, no matter how much we assimilate. And he went home to Austria and he sat down and he penned his most famous pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which he will then publish in 1896, having the Dreyfus affair in 1895. And upon publishing this, he also had the means to spread this message. And he began spreading this message throughout Europe. And by 1897, as a result, the first Zionist Congress is going to meet in Basel, Switzerland. And the first Zionist Congress will convene to essentially establish political Zionism. We are now going to begin the movement to attain sovereignty for the Jewish people. Now, if you see in this slide, it says they sought to restore the independence, right, in their ancestral homeland. Now, let's be very clear. In the early years of this movement, Israel was not necessarily the land that they were focused on, not all of them at least, and not Herzl. And we know that because within 6 years, the British are going to offer the Jews Uganda, which is really Kenya today, just FYI. And there's going to be this debate in the Zionist Congress. And Herzl will say, well, maybe we should take it because we got to free ourselves from anti-Semitism as maybe as a temporary plan before we go home. And the Zionist Congress put their foot down and said, no, we have a claim to one land, and that's our ancestral homeland. And that's where we need to focus our attention. And from that moment on, really, the political Zionist movement becomes not just about restoring our sovereignty or retaining Jewish sovereignty, but it's about restoring our sovereignty in our historic and ancestral homeland. And so this slide is very important because not only does it frame Zionism as a liberation movement of the 19th century, but it also then translates Zionism to today. And it's so important that we all know a core, concise, clear definition of Zionism. And here is one for you up on the screen. That today, modern Zionism is the belief in and support for Jewish self-determination in their historic indigenous homeland. So it was about seeking, restoring that sovereignty. Once we attained that sovereignty, today it's believing in and supporting the existence of that Jewish state in that land. Now, as a result of this, what happens? More Jews are going to get the Zionist bug and want to immigrate. But of course, it's going to take something usually to push them over the edge. And so, of course, in 1903, the Jews are going to suffer yet another pogrom, this time in Kishinev. And as a result of the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, two things happen. One, a second aliyah, a second wave begins from 1904 to 1914. Jews coming from more still Russia, but also more Central Europe as we move towards Western Europe. And another form of Zionism is going to emerge, what we now know of as revisionist Zionism. Now, revisionist Zionism was about creating a new Jew as well, but a different kind of new Jew than labor Zionists. For them, it was about creating a new Jew who was a fighter. The Kishinev pogrom, for some Jews, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And there were some like Nachman Bialik, who's going to, yes, be a cultural Zionist because he's a poet, but he writes this poem after Kishinev where he almost blames the Jews, but he not blames, but he calls out and he says, we're supposed to be the children of the Maccabees and we just let them kill us. You just watched as they raped your women and killed your children. And it was this cry of enough is enough. We need to take our fate into our own hands and protect ourselves and not expect anybody else to do it for us. And this is the cry of revisionist Zionism. And from this, you'll have characters like Zev Jabotinsky, who will embody this throughout the pre-state era. And so now as Jews are immigrating in between 1904 and 1914, they're coming in with Zionist fervor. And it's not just about going and working the land, because yes, you still had labor Zionists. You had A.D. Gordon come and he's going to work himself to death in the land. But you're also going to have these new Jews who come in saying, we're going to come, we're going to settle, and we're going to protect ourselves. We're going to create a Jewish militia that can protect themselves. And so what we start to see is real tension. Because in the first Aliyah, the tension between the Jews and the Arabs was minimal. It was minimal. Because most of the Jews were coming in, just buying land, convenient, settling. They brought in like a better economy. There were improvements. Some of the Arabs welcomed them in. Comes the second Aliyah, and yes, some Arabs are still welcoming us in, and some Arabs are still selling land to the Jews. But for some Arabs, they're hearing this idea of, no, the Jews aren't just coming here to live here. The Jews are coming here to establish their sovereignty here. And we want to be sovereign here. We want to get rid of the Ottomans and not so that they can be replaced by the Jews, so that we can have Arab control. We start to see the tension get worse. We start to see more attacks that begin, or not more, but attacks start against Jews on roads, Jewish fields. And this is where we actually see the first Jewish militia emerge. The first Jewish militia, which isn't really a militia, it's more like a guarding force called Hashomer, which makes sense because they are the guards, the protectors. They would protect the fields. They would protect Jews. And so that's when we see this tension begin. Now, comes. So, and again, when I say that these people are coming in with Zionist fervor, let's understand, here is the establishment of Tel Aviv, right north of Jaffa on the sand dunes of the Mediterranean. And this was in 1909, right? The Shell lottery where they divvied up the land. 20 years later, this is what Tel Aviv is going to look like. These people were not messing around. They were coming in to build a country well before they had a mandate to do so. That was the vision. And no matter how much we talk about Arab nationalism and Zionism emerging at sort of the same time, Zionism with the Zionist Congress and Jewish thinkers will be worlds above Arab nationalism by the time World War I hits. And actually, World War I is going to be one of the many things that kind of usher in and really give a lot of momentum to Arab nationalism. And so there were different driving forces here. Now, I just said it, comes World War I, and the Ottomans, of course, are still in control, right? And they join up with, we're going to be the losing side, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And a few things happened during the war. So first of all, the British and the French are going to have their little secret negotiation because they want to take down the Ottoman Empire and they want to figure out who's going to get what. And so they sit down and they hammer out an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1915. And Sykes-Picot essentially is the British and the French again saying, when we win, the French will get this, we'll get this, and we'll, this will be your sphere of influence and this will be our sphere of influence. Again, these people were colonialists, right? That was the idea, just more colonialism, more imperialism. Let's spread our reach and our influence. And then what they realize is, we don't want to send forces, our own troops from Europe into the Middle East. So let's try to maybe recruit locals to help us fight in the area. So Sir McMahon, who is the High Commissioner in Egypt for the British, is going to reach out to a guy in the Hijaz. I brought up his name earlier, the Hijaz down here today, the Arabian Peninsula, a guy by the name of Hussein ibn Ali, who is the Sharif of Mecca and the leader of the Hashemite Arab tribe. And again, he's down here in the Hijaz, based in Mecca, like I said, the Sharif of Mecca. And they go to him and they say, Hussein, help us fight against the Ottomans. And he says, okay, but what are you going to give me? And there's this back and forth between Hussein and McMahon, which becomes known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence of 1916. And in this correspondence, McMahon commits and says, you know what, you help us fight, and we're going to help create an Arab nation from Damascus over to Baghdad, down into the Arabian Peninsula. And Hussein's thinking, well, that includes Palestine. And McMahon's thinking, no, it doesn't. And they don't discuss. And what's going to happen is a guy, as we all know, by the name of Lawrence of Arabia, as he will become known as, is going to be sent down into the Arabian Peninsula to rally these troops who will fight under the guise of Hussein's son, Emir Faisal. And that's one thing that's going to happen. They won't really see much action, let's be honest. They'll see one real battle that'll kind of shift the war. Other than that, mostly chill. Meanwhile, a guy whose name I brought up, Zev Jabotinsky, he turns to the British. He's in Palestine, and he says to the British, we'll help you fight against the Ottomans. And they create a Jewish legion under the British army to fight against the Ottomans in Palestine. Meanwhile, while that's happening, the Jewish Mule Corps, I believe is what it was called. And meanwhile, in Britain, in Great Britain, you've got people lobbying for Zionism, right? You've got Chaim Weizmann, right, who was a famous chemist in Manchester University, good friends with Churchill. And so he's lobbying for Zionism. He has his good friend, Lord Balfour, and they're schmoozing, and they're also Christians. And they very much believe in this messianic idea of Jews need to return to the land. And so slowly but surely, we have people within British Parliament really taking on the Zionist idea. And so in 1917, after now the British have officially actually taken control over Jerusalem, for example, in September, by November of 1917, the British are now going to issue the Promise to the Jews, the Balfour Declaration, that reads out, His Majesty, the King views in favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So we're going to have a problem because this war ends and the British have made a lot of deals and they're going to have to figure out how this is all going to work out. Now, we all know World War I is going to end with the armistice in November of 1918. Eventually, the Treaty of Versailles will be signed. And what will emerge out of World War I is the League of Nations, right? This idea put forward by Wilson with his 14 points, self-determination, nationalism. And so the issue of the territory of the Ottoman Empire is handed over to the League of Nations. And the League of Nations sits down in San Remo in Italy in 1920 at the San Remo Conference, and they decide to map out this territory and break it up into different mandates. And so for our purposes, the mandate that is created for the Jews is the British Mandate of Palestine. And this is what it looked like in its original inception. Now, this was the League of Nations swooping in, having no understanding of the Middle East, let's be honest. And they decide, okay, let's give all this land to the Jews. And as you see, they say this is going to be a reaffirmation of the Balfour Declaration, and that the British will control this territory, and their goal is to establish a national home for the Jews by doing these things, facilitating Jewish immigration, encouraging settlement by Jews, etc. There's a problem, again, because the British made a deal, and they made a deal with the Hashemites, who want to see land being given to them. And so what happens is the British, over the 3-year period from 1920 to 1923, are going to redraw this map. And by 1923, upon its ratification by British Parliament, they will have chopped off 77% and given it over to the Hashemites. So Hussein's son, Abdullah, is going to become the king of Transjordan, or what is formerly known as the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, and that's still its name until today, except for the trans. His other son, Emir Faisal, who actually had taken control of Damascus and created for a hot second his own kingdom in Syria, he's going to be kicked out by the French, and he's going to be moved to Baghdad, and he'll be given the territory of Iraq. Meanwhile, their father was supposed to maintain power in the Arabian Peninsula. He will be ousted by a man named Ibn Saud, and upon which upon his name and his family, Saudi Arabia will emerge in the 1920s. So what's left of the territory between the river and the sea is now ratified by the British, an agreement from the League of Nations that this is going to become a national home for the Jewish people, and this becomes international law. Now we have a problem. There are Arabs who live here, and the Arabs don't want to live in a Jewish country. Again, especially the Arab leadership here, at least the Muslim leadership here, a man by the name of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he's a pan-Arabist. He wants to be part of Faisal's Syrian kingdom when it happened. And now in the 20s, he still wants to be part of this larger Arab nation that the Arabs are pushing to be established. And so Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and again, other Arabs who are living here have a valid point, right? We're the majority. You're giving all the land to the Jews. We're going to go from living under the Ottomans to now living under the Jews. What the hell? Now, that's a legitimate idea, and I think we can all agree that that's a legitimate idea. What I think we'll all also agree with is, even if you feel that way, what's not legitimate is to then go and kill Jews to stop this from happening. If you have an issue with the British or the League of Nations, take it up with the British or with the League of Nations. That's not what happened. Unfortunately, in 1920, even before the British Mandate is ratified, but after the San Remo Conference, Hajj Amin al-Husseini is going to initiate an attack against the Jews. This will be in April of 1920, when there's a festival going on in Jerusalem called the Nabi Musa Festival, which is actually the festival for the prophet Moses, Nabi Musa. And during this festival in Jerusalem, Hajj Amin will go out and he will make a speech, and he'll say, massacre the Jews, and he'll incite, and a riot will break out. And Jews will be killed. The British will do very little to stop it. Some even try to claim that the Jews started this riot. It happens in 1920. It happens again in 1921. And as a result of this, the Jews are going to now form their first formal militia. And it's going to be formed by none other than Zev Jabotinsky, which again totally fits the idea of revisionist Zionism. And it's going to be called the Haganah, that emerges in 1920. And the Haganah will be the defensive force fighting on behalf of the Jews and protecting the Jews throughout the 1920s and really 30s and into the 40s. I'm going to be jumping back between these two slides. So again, if you're taking notes, just know I'm going to go back and forth, but for good reason. Again, as you see on this list of years, 1929, there is another attack. This time, it's extreme. It's a massacre that takes place in Hebron, and significant violence in places like Tzfat and Jerusalem. And in Hebron in particular, Jews are going to be massacred by their neighbors. We should note that some Arabs actually protected Jews during this time period, during this massacre. Unfortunately, though, a lot of Arabs turned on their neighbors, and 69 Jews will be murdered in Hebron. And when I say murdered, I mean mutilated. I mean, what was done to them was horrific and almost hard to describe in words. And this will send a chill down the spine of many Hagananics who look at themselves saying, we're supposed to be defending Jews and protecting Jews, and we failed. And some of them who were Beitarnikim, now Beitar is the youth movement of the revisionist Zionist movement of Jabotinsky. Some of these guys who grew up in Beitar and or were Hagananic said, you know what, this whole idea of just defense is not working. And we need to become a little bit more offensive. We need to become a little bit more aggressive in the way in which we respond to these types of attacks. And so what we have emerge in 1931 is the Irgun, or what we know of in Hebrew as Etzel, Irgun Tzva Leumi. Now, Etzel, again, emerges with this idea of, we're going to protect Jews, and when there's, an attack, we're going to retaliate, and we're going to do what we need to do to stop Jews from being killed. But then they realized they have a much bigger problem than what was happening in the land. That much bigger problem was happening in a place called Germany, because it was 1931. And the Nazi Party was already gaining popularity, and propaganda and anti-Semitism was starting to grow. And so in the early years of the 1930s, the Irgun will focus on saving Jews, but in a different place, saving Jews by getting them out of Europe. And what they will do is they'll send emissaries to places like Germany and others, trying to convince Jews to get the visas and get out now. And they'll engage in illegal immigration. Now, why illegal? Weren't the British supposed to encourage Jewish settlement? Well, after the Hebron massacre, the aftermath wasn't just that the Jews went on to create the Irgun. It also wasn't just that the British decided to then expel all of the remaining Jews from Hebron, turning Hebron into a Jew-free city for the first time probably in 1,000 years. But they also decided to send a commission. The Hope Simpson Commission ends up in Palestine. And they come to survey the area, check out what's going on. And Hope Simpson decides to write up a report that essentially says that there's a problem in the land, and the problem is with unemployment. And so the British should probably start to limit immigration to ensure that there isn't too much unemployment. Of course, where were they going to limit immigration from? Predominantly from the sea barriers, from people who were coming in from Europe. What they didn't really do was monitor the land barriers. And so what we have throughout the 30s is we have slowly this reduction in immigration, in visas being given out to Jews to immigrate, permits for Jews to immigrate, but Arabs continue to immigrate in pretty unfettered from the land barriers. And so you have illegal immigration for people who couldn't get permits. But mostly this was legal immigration. And actually 29 to 39 is going to be the biggest immigration of Jews into the land, what is known as the fifth Aliyah. And it happens where you have 250,000 Jews immigrated in this 10-year period. Now, by the time we get to 1936, 66,000 Jews alone immigrate just in that 1 year in 1936. And Haj Amin al-Husseini is losing his mind because he doesn't want to see more Jews immigrate. He doesn't want to see the Jews get close to a majority. And so in 1936, he's going to start a revolt. This time, not just going after the Jews, but also going after the British. And not only going after the British, he also decides to go after other Arabs. Let's again remember, okay? The Arabs have now adopted an Arab identity. They're Arabs, but they're still tribal. And these tribes are not necessarily friends with each other, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. So actually, the primary tribe that was against the Husseinis, Haj Amin al-Husseini and his clan, was a tribe called the Nashashibis. And in 1936, they actually unite in this beginning rebellion against the British. But then in 1936, the British tried to stop the rebellion, to try to stop the revolt. And they realized, you know what, a few things. One, maybe we screwed up. We gave all the land to the Jews when there were a bunch of Arabs here, and maybe that wasn't the best idea. There was also a changing sentiment within the British government. There were some anti-Semites in the British government. There were some people who very much believed that they were backing the wrong horse because there are a lot more Arabs than there are Jews. And they needed something from the Arab world at this point in history. And that was this big thing that we now call oil. And so they try to change the mandate in 1937. They send another commission to the land, surveys the area. It was called the Peel Commission. And the Peel Commission in 1937 is going to put out an offer, an idea. Let's change the British mandate. Let's throw out the mandate and let's create this instead. So what did they say to the Jews? They said, look, Jews, we know that we gave you 100% and that's legally binding and everything, but would you guys be okay with accepting just 20% instead of 100? Like the areas where you guys live. And then we're going to give 75% to the Arabs. Now, which Arabs? The Hashemites, but it's going to be like two states, maybe under the control of the Hashemites. So a confederated state under the control of the Hashemites. So no independent Palestinian state at this stage is being discussed. And then we, the British, we're going to hold on to 5%. And the craziest thing is that while Ben Gurion might have hesitated a little bit, Ben Gurion ultimately lobbied for this plan. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's 1937. Let's remember what was happening in Europe. 1933, Hitler takes power. 1935, the Nuremberg laws are passed. By 1937, Jews in Germany have been stripped of their citizenship. Their businesses have been boycotted. They've dealt with attacks, harassment. And so things aren't looking good. And so he says, you know what? We'll take what we can get right now. Maybe, hopefully, we'll get more land in the future, but we'll take it. Now, in the beginning of this class, I talked to you all about root causes of the conflict. And we talked about one of them last class, and that was land. Today, we've talked about one more. And that was nationalism, clashing nationalisms. Not only that we want to live on this land, but who's going to rule this land? The Peel Commission, the reaction to the Peel Commission, what we will see is a third root cause emerge. And that root cause was the unification of Arab leadership under one ideological banner, what we call today Arab rejectionism. The idea that a Jewish state cannot exist in any borders. And again, the Arab leaders made it very clear at this time that that was exactly why they said no to this plan. And so while the Jews lobbied for it, even though Jabotinsky was against it, and even the Zionist Congress was against it, but Ben Gurion here in the land said, we'll take it. It didn't pass in parliament. And so the Peel Commission was dead. And nothing happened with it. And the revolt continued. But the revolt continued, and at this stage, the Nashashibis split off from the Husseinis and say, we don't want to go along with you in this violent, streak. And so he went after them too. And so between 1936 and 1939, this Arab revolt is going to actually lead to thousands of Arabs being killed, mostly at the hands of other Arabs, where you're going to have less than 1,000 Brits and Jews killed during this rebellion. But by 1939, the British want to end this revolt and they want to restore calm. And so they're going to appease the Arabs. And I use that term very strategically because it's 1939. And this was the height of British appeasement, as we all know. And what happens? Well, in May of 39, now let's remember something, May of 39. So what's happened already before this in Europe? Let's be very clear. Yes, the Nuremberg laws. Yes, we talked about 37. Let's get to 38. The Anschluss happens in 38. And I know I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but this was the annexation of Austria by the Germans. So now all of the Nuremberg laws have been extended now to Austrian Jews as well. And they were banging down the doors to get the hell out of Germany/Austria. And so comes the summer of 1938, and a conference is convened in Evian, France, called the Evian Conference. And it's essentially the Germans bringing together a bunch of countries from around the world saying, who is willing to take our Jewish refugees? And everyone said no. There was one country that raised their quota, and that was the Dominican Republic. Other than that, and they didn't raise it by much. Other than that, they were told, we just can't take them in. Remember, it was the Depression. I get that countries were struggling, but they said no. And a lot of people argue that that was a message to the Germans. Do what you want with the Jews. And we all know November of 1938, Kristallnacht will happen, the night of broken glass. And so this is May of 1939. And maybe, yeah, you couldn't have predicted what was going to happen because nobody could have predicted what was going to happen, but it didn't look like things were going well for the Jews in Europe. And so come May of 1939, and the British go ahead and they pass the famous Palestine White Papers, which essentially limit Jewish immigration dramatically into the territory. They say that over the next 5 years, between 39 and 44, only 75,000 Jews will be able to immigrate in. And that land sales to Jews will be banned in over 80% of the territory. So completely going back on the mandate, right? Which they're supposed to encourage Jewish settlements and get Jews to buy land and all this stuff, completely out the window. And the writing, I mean, that was it, right? It's May of 39. 3 months later, Germany is going to invade Poland on September 1st. World War II is officially going to begin. And now borders shut basically entirely. And if the Jews didn't get out of these countries before, the chances of them getting out now are slim to none. We all know what's going to happen in Europe, but we have a problem in Palestine, right? In the British Mandate, because the British, many people believe, just abandoned us, right? And had just passed this thing that completely goes against their support for the Jews. But at the same time, the British are also fighting against the Nazis. So what do? Do we fight against the British who are fighting against our other bigger enemy? Or do we fight with the British against the Nazis? Well, Ben-Gurion had a weird approach. He said, let's fight the White Papers as if there's no Hitler, and let's fight against the Nazis as if there's no white paper. So we're going to fight against the British and we're going to fight with the British. Now, there were some in the land that were not having this. And there were some who weren't even having the Irgun's mentality. And so we have another militia that's going to emerge as a result of this. And that militia is called the Lehi, who are going to emerge in 1940. Now, their focus is very clear and very sharp. They're focused on the British. They believe, again, the British have abandoned the Jews, and they are now on a war path to get the British out of Palestine. The Irgun are going to help them as well. Now, 1940, 1941, 42, 43, again, Ben-Gurion is trying to maintain the status of being with the British. There's even another Jewish militia a Jewish legion that's going to form under the British military. They will break off very quickly to become the famous Palmach, who eventually will join up with the Haganah and be the special forces unit of the Haganah. But again, he's trying to fight with them. And so he has to go against the Irgun and against the Lehi. And there was even this period called the hunting season, where he actually helped the British hunt down Irgun and Lehi members. But as time goes on, and really the horrors of what's happening in Europe are slowly coming to light, Ben-Gurion says, enough is enough. We have to turn. And there's this period where they kind of unite in their fight against the British. The war ends in 1945, and the real horrors start to emerge. And the craziest part is that even after the horrors start to emerge, the British still refuse to lift a quota. They still are not allowing Jews to immigrate to Palestine. And so Jews who are leaving Europe from displaced persons camps, getting on boats, like we all know, the famous Exodus, are going to sail towards the shores of Palestine and be turned away, be brought to the shores and then sent to camps in Cyprus. And this is enraging the Lehi and the Irgun and even Ben-Gurion. Hence the bombing of British headquarters, which is of course located in the current King David Hotel. The bombing of British headquarters in the King David Hotel in July of 1946. Because again, how can you be stopping Jews who just went through the Holocaust from finding safety in Palestine? Meanwhile, Haj Amin is now persona non grata, according to the British, because after 1939 and his revolt, he was sent into exile. He spent most of the war years actually in Germany, helping to recruit SS fighters for the Nazis. And then he ends up in Egypt, okay? And the Arabs are also sitting there going, but you shouldn't let the Jews in. Why should we pay the price for what happened in Europe? So there's a lot going on in the land. The Jews and the Arabs are both against the British because they both feel betrayed by the British. The Arabs are still killing Jews. Jews are retaliating, killing Arabs. And I should have mentioned this a while earlier, but let's understand that by 1937, the Irgun is very much going to turn offensive in the sense that their retaliatory attacks against Arabs will be essentially If you kill innocent Jews, we're going to kill innocent Arabs. And it's going to be a tit for tat. And so this becomes very heavily debated within the Jewish community today. Back then, the Haganah, mainstream condemned them for what they were doing. But this was something that was happening throughout the 30s and 40s, or throughout the late 30s and into the 40s, these kind of retaliatory attacks. So comes 1947, and the British are in the middle of all of it. And they're done, right? They're like leaving India. They're just slowly but surely. And so they turn over to the UN and they say, you know what, you guys solve the problem. And so in 1947, in the summer of 47, the UN sends the UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, to the territory. And the UN Special Committee on Palestine is going to come. They're going to survey the area. They're going to talk to Arab leadership, civil society. They're going to talk to Jewish leadership. And they're going to come up with two ideas. The first idea is a binational state. Oh, they'll just live together in one country. And very quickly they were like, yeah, that's not going to work. Obviously, the plan that they're going to propose is going to be the famous partition plan of 1947. Now, we will start with this next time, but I want to end by pointing something out. Now, as you saw this transition from this to this, what we see is the Jews go from being offered 20% to being offered 55%. The Arabs, and now which Arabs? The Palestinian Arabs are going to go from being offered nothing to being offered an independent state in 45% of the land. And the Jews, of course, say yes. And Arab rejectionism being alive and well, of course, the Arab world rejects this idea. But I want to, and we'll start with this next time, of that rejection and what happens as a result. But I want to point something out. You know, you have to ask yourself, what changed between 37 and 47? And of course, there's a glaring, obvious thing that changed. But I really want to emphasize this. You know, in 1937, it might have still been very easy to look at Jews and say, you know, why do you need a country? Like, I get it, like a massacre there, a pogrom there, persecution, it sucks. But like, really, what's the worst that can happen? We were Zionists before the Holocaust. Many Jews were Zionists before the Holocaust. Herzl talked about establishing a state 50 years before the Holocaust. But what took the world to realize Zionism was the Holocaust. Because what had the Jews been saying? We can't live under your mercy anymore. We can't live with you guys at the hope that you'll protect us, right? We need a nation of our own and an army of our own so we can protect ourselves. And they're like, nah, what do you mean? Come on, we'll protect you. You're exaggerating. And then, of course, came the world's abandonment of the Jews in the 1940s. And so by 1947, nobody had the audacity to look at a Jew and say, why do you need a country? It was so obvious. And I say that, unfortunately, because I feel like I'm back in 1937 today. I feel like every day I'm asked, why do you need a country? I feel like every day I find myself defending Israel's right to exist and the need for a Jewish country in 2021. And so I want to remind us all of 1937, and I want to remind us all of what it took for the world to finally jump on the Zionism train. But once we got it, and once we prospered and became no longer a defenseless minority, many people jumped off that train. A train that they never really wanted to be on to begin. And so in 1947, yeah, for the first time and for a moment, the world understood the need for a Jewish country. We need to remind them of that. What we also see happen at this point is Palestinian nationalism. For the first time, now we're talking about an independent Palestinian state emerging. And we'll talk more about that in our last session when we go into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in session 4. So I know I've gone a minute over time. I apologize. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the War of Independence. And like I said, explained in the first class, and I'll explain it again. The next two sessions are going to veer off from the same point, 1948 to today, but looking at it through the lens of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then our last class, we'll jump back to 1948 and we'll look at it through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'll explain throughout how they tend to overlap here and there and why they weren't totally separate conflicts to begin with. But they take on very, very different characteristics post-1967 that need to be discussed separately. And so that'll be our focus for the next class, again, 1948 to today, honing in on the rise and decline of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Hi, we're live, I believe. We're back live. I'm glad you stayed with us for that. Thank you, Charlotte, for another inspiring lecture. It was fast. It was really, really thorough, and I'm sure there are many questions. Those of you who have already asked questions and have typed them into the chat, we have them. If there are additional questions or follow-ups, you can continue to use the chat. Just type them in and direct your chat questions or send your chat questions to the host who is, it says, look under P, it says, please direct questions to me, Jeff Carmel. He is compiling the questions. Again, go to the chat icon, click on the little arrow on the blue bar, look under P, and direct your questions to please direct questions to me. So there you go. And then Jeff will have them. So Mike, are you there?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so great. So thank you for being here to answer the questions. Let's see, the first question the group posed is, can you please explain more about the Effendis? Who were they? Where were they? How they sold the land to the Jews?
Sure. I will point out that Charlotte's knowledge, of the Arab society in the pre-state era probably significantly, exceeds mine. But these were, as she pointed out, these were clan leaders. These were people who were, for lack of a better term, the nobility in Arab society. And many of them lived outside the land of Israel. These, in many cases, were absentee landowners. They lived in Beirut, they lived in Damascus, they lived in Amman, they lived in Cairo. But these were the people that when the Fellahin sold their land, these other folks were out of town. They just ended up buying it. How they got to the point of being the cream of the crop in Arab society, that I don't know. But it's a really important point to understand that very, very often these were not families living on the land itself. They were absentees. Also, as it turned out, if you then move ahead to the outbreak of hostilities after the partition plan, these were the people who then moved their families. The elites were the first group of Arab society to flee because they had family, they had houses, they had bases, they had communities in Beirut, in Damascus, in Amman, in Cairo. And so they were the first ones to evacuate, understanding that the violence was going to come, which it did because the Mufti and people aligned with him promised it.
Got it. Well, so the next question is sort of related to that. Could you please show the areas where the Jews bought the land? In other words, do you have a map that you could share with us that would show the land that was purchased and where that was?
Yes, absolutely. Let me go ahead and screen share here and make sure this works. And here we go. All right. So are you able to see that?
Excellent. Yep.
Okay, great. So what this is, we're going to start. This is a map of the malaria areas in the British Mandate of Palestine. Okay, and the darker shaded areas had a higher incidence of malaria. This was the famous swampland when the Zionists came to the land and drained the swamps. So you can see up here, in the northern part of the area, the Hula Valley, the Jezreel Valley over here, the coastal plain, and the Jordan Valley. Okay. And then you go down and look at the map of where the Jews settled. Same areas, the Hula Valley, the Jezreel Valley, other areas around the Kinneret, and the coastal plain. And then, of course, this is the area going up to Jerusalem, which being at higher elevation, it was not malaria zone. And Jerusalem, of course, obviously had very special significance. Jerusalem had a Jewish majority by about 1860 or so. But look how well this correlates, Jewish areas of settlement to the malaria zone. And then if you move further ahead into history, look at the partition plan. This was the UN partition plan in 1947. And the northern part of that has a very, very close correlation to exactly those areas, because of course, the way that the partition plan map was drawn, the Jews constituted a majority of the population in the areas put aside for the Jewish state. So of course, those lines were drawn where the Jews were, but it actually does significantly go back to that malaria zone.
Got it. So one of the questions was this question was also typed in during during Charlotte's lecture, and I'm not sure exactly where it when it was typed in, so what it referred to, excuse me, and what she was talking about. But I think it was a discussion of who was living in the land at the time, and it says 1 Effendi, 2 Falachin. What is the third? So I assume that's who else was there. Does that make sense?
Well, there was a Arab merchant class. They lived in some of the cities. It was predominantly a rural society, but there were absolutely city dwellers. So you did have this sort of middle merchant class as well. So that's the other folks who were there. Any historical look back on the population of Palestine during the Ottoman era is fraught with all sorts of errors. I think they ran one census in the 1830s. They just put the numbers out. There was no verification of any way to really test these out. But she's right that if you look at around 1870, 1880, the start of the Zionist movement, Jews constituted only about 10% of the population there. A lot of it was Arab, a lot of it was Turkish, a lot of it was Greek. It was a crossroads area, but there's no good numbers. The only census that was done during the British Mandate period, there was a census in 1923 or so, but everything before and after that just ends up being estimates.
Got it. The next one is, can you clarify who the Hashemites were?
Yeah. So the Hashemites came from, as she pointed out, the Hijaz, what is now Saudi Arabia. They were a clan, so it was the Hashemite clan, and they were not indigenous to either Jordan or Iraq, but because of all of the machinations that Britain went through. And, Britain certainly, they made promises to both sides, as was pointed out. Britain had T.E. Lawrence down there, who was authorized to make all sorts of promises to the Arabs. And then in 1917, they came out with the Balfour Declaration and made promises to the Jews. And they had the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French. So the British were all over the place there, but it was sort of the way of imperialism. Oh, you're living down there. You're not necessarily doing that well because this guy Ibn Saud has a lot of control over there. Well, let's go ahead and give your kids Jordan and Iraq. And this was the way things were done 100 years ago.
Very helpful. So what justified the British expulsion? The question is the British expulsion of Jews from Hebron.
Yeah, basically they said, we cannot keep you safe. So we will be unable to protect you. You're going to have to leave. And it's important to note that the community in Hebron, this was not a modern Zionist settlement. This was an ancient community that, as Charlotte pointed out, had been there for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And they'd lived through the Crusades, they'd lived through the Mongol conquest, they'd lived through the Ottoman conquest. So this is a very, very long-standing community. They were not armed. They were basically like a lot of today's ultra-Orthodox communities. They spent their time studying Torah. They were poor. They didn't have the means of self-defense. So the British just said, we're going to evacuate you for your own safety because we cannot protect you from the Arabs.
Got it. The next question is about the Evian Conference. The question is, was it Franklin Roosevelt or the Nazis who called for it, and how did it come about? Can you talk a little more about that?
The Evian Conference, I do know, it was in France. It was in the 1930s. As far as I understand, the Nazis didn't participate in this. I may be wrong about that, but it was really a conference of the Western nations to, Hitler threw down this challenge, like, okay, who's going to take the Jews here? And, the Western nations met and nobody was able to do anything about it. And that pretty much, either that and then the white paper, of course, sealed the fate of Europe's Jews, because the only place that otherwise they could have gone to was the British Mandate that had been promised to be a national home for the Jewish people.
Why wasn't a Palestinian state formed after the 1947 partition?
Because the Arab population of Palestine rejected it. They were not going to share the land. They made it very, very clear that this was going to be a war to eliminate the Jews from there. And this also fed into local politics within the neighboring Arab countries. Egypt wanted the Negev desert. Jordan wanted to take control over the central part, and Syria wanted to go ahead and get the Galilee. And that was pretty much how it would have ended up had the Arabs been victorious. But this was described by Mahmoud Abbas decades later as an absolutely catastrophic mistake on their part, not accepting partition and creating the first Palestinian Arab state in history.
So now we get a literary question for you. Is Leon Uris's Exodus a fairly accurate history of the historical roots and conflicts leading to the rise of the Jewish state?
I have not read Exodus. I have seen the movie several times. And of course, the movie was designed for popular culture. But, the general story is correct. There were Arab communities that were friendly with the Jews and got along well with them. And there were Arab communities that were irrevocably hostile. And if you notice, this is a pattern that then plays out in the 1948 War of Independence. There's a place in the Galilee, and I've been there. It's a national park called Sippori, and Sippori was actually a really well-populated Jewish town that did not fight against the Romans. Amazing old synagogue there. But you stand in Sippori, you're a few miles away from Nazareth, and you look across the road, maybe a mile away, and there's a couple Arab villages. One of them is Rumat Hib. I forget the name of the other one. They're right across the road. But in Sippori itself, which had become an Arab town called Safaria, there are no more Arabs. And there's acknowledgement, in the little local museum that the Arabs who were there attacked the Jewish forces, and the Jews counterattacked, and the Arabs fled and or were expelled. So why is it that the Arabs in Rumat Hib are still there and the Arabs in Sippori are not? And why are the Arabs in Abu Ghosh, just outside of Jerusalem, still there? And the Arabs in Castel, just up the road from Abu Ghosh, were not. And that was based on the local Mukhtar, the local village leader's decision to engage in the fight against the Jews or not to engage in the fight against the Jews. The Mukhtar of Abu Ghosh, the Mukhtar of Rumat Hib, they just said, we're not going to send militias out. We're not going to engage in fighting. And the Israelis left them alone. The ones who did engage in hostilities ended up suffering consequences. So on a small scale, certainly, in Exodus, where you had the neighboring village where the Mukhtar was not hostile to the Jews, but ended up getting killed for it, that played itself out in multiple villages all across the land.
Got it. By the way, this question isn't for you. This is for everybody. The question says, can we have access to the presentation? And yes, just a reminder, you will be sent links after this, and you can revisit any of the questions or any of the parts of the presentation that you want. Back to you, Mike. It says, I have also learned that the Jews who bought the land had to buy it twice, one from the local effendis and then from the Turks. Is that the case?
I cannot answer that one. I'm not sure of the details of the land purchases on that. Certainly, whatever they ended up paying and whoever they paid it to was considerably above the value of the land because the Jews were willing to pay a higher amount for it. And again, a lot of this, as you saw on the map there, was malaria-ridden swampland. And malaria was a very, very significant cause of failure of a lot of the early Zionist settlements.
So you may have already gotten to this, but this is a slightly different take on it. It says, please explain the reasons that the Fellaheen had to sell their land to the Effendi class.
I don't believe there was any compulsion that they had to sell, but these were basically very poor subsistence farmers. And so if things were not going well, if they had drought, if they had bad harvest, they ended up needing money. And the arrangement typically was that they would sell the land to, these effendis, mostly absentee, but would be allowed to stay on the land and work it, basically sharecroppers.
Was the white paper a reversal of the Balfour Declaration?
Basically, yes, because the promise of Balfour was creating a national home for the Jewish people, and the white paper shut the doors to immigration.
Why did the Arabs say no to the partition plan? Was it not a good deal for them? What is their version? What are the different narratives?
The Palestinian nationalism, and again, certainly in an ideal world where you had a Palestinian leadership that would be willing to live in peace alongside the Jewish state rather than seek to eliminate it, great. Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful thing to have. But Palestinian nationalism is the only modern nationalism that arose not for the benefit of its own people, but its driving force is the elimination of the nation state of another people. And this, unfortunately, the rejectionism, as Charlotte pointed out, has been consistent through the decades. And that's the major problem, that the Jews said yes multiple times and the Arabs have said no multiple times. Because the question is not to them whether there should be a Palestinian Arab state. The question is whether there should be a Jewish state.
I think there's just one last question here, and it's, who were the players in the original Zionist meeting?
You talk about the first Zionist Congress, right? That's what I would assume the question is.
I think that's as good a guess as any.
Yeah. I know some of the names, obviously, Herzl was the one who led it. Max Nordau was a very prominent Zionist. But in terms of who was actually there, beyond major names, I couldn't really tell you. There were a number of Zionist delegations from different countries that were involved. So this was really across Europe. You had Russian groups, you had German groups, you had French groups. I would point out, and Charlotte touched on this a little bit, but in terms of different streams of Zionism, if anybody has the time and the interest, there's a wonderful anthology that was published about 3 years ago from Gil Troy, who is a tremendous historian and both writes and speaks very well. It's called The Zionist Ideas. It's the sort of modern reboot of a book by Hertzberg called The Zionist Idea from back in the 1950s. And what Gil Troy does is he takes the different streams of Zionism, labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, cultural Zionism, religious Zionism, through the ages, the founders, the builders, and then now the modern ones in Israel. And he just has an anthology of various original source writings. And, it's about 500 some odd pages. It's really long, but it really gives you a wonderful overview of these different branches of Zionism and the sweep through history and how they interacted with each other.
Great. Again, I have another question here that says, will we be getting a recording of the Q&A? And yes, you will. You'll be getting a recording of the whole thing at the end. In about 2 or 3 days, you'll have a summary recording of the whole thing. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for handling so many questions. And thanks to all of you for caring enough to come. We're looking forward to seeing you next Sunday. And just a reminder, that's the 29th of January, 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. And Charlotte will be teaching and handling Q&A in real time. It will not be pre-recorded. You can use the same link for the class that you have. If you would like to invite others to join the class for the next 3 sessions, people are still willing to sign up. You're still welcome to have them sign up. In the following email that you'll receive in the next few days, there will be links for, yes, the recording you just heard, the class you just heard, and there will also be a link that you can invite friends to register if they still would like to do that. So you can feel free to share that link. We particularly encourage you to invite your children or grandchildren who are bar mitzvah age and above to join us, and they can catch up on the first 2 classes by watching the recordings. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you next Sunday.